Hello, my name is Maye from University College Cork. I'm presenting this SIGCHI 2020 talk on behalf of my colleagues. In this talk, we argue identifying community needs and values as imperative before deployment of technology for community radio in rural communities. Community radio is geared towards promoting freedom of expression and is run by and for community members primarily on a volunteer basis. Here we present findings following our engagements with 3 rural communities in Europe during the setup stages of a community radio station. We then illustrate considerations that may be useful for designers and community radio experts when implementing community radio technologies in rural areas. This work was supported by the Grassroots Radio Project, an EU Horizon 2020 geared towards lowering the barriers of setting up and sustaining a community radio station in rural areas. So then, why centre design and innovation based on rural needs and values? Well, according to the UN, over 3 billion people live in rural areas worldwide. As you can see from this graphic, that's almost half of the world's population, and that is crazy. In HTI, there's been a growing interest in designing in rural areas. As highlighted by HTI Research, rural design is often influenced by urban subjectivities, whereby rural areas are seen to need to catch up with those of the urban. However, people in rural areas have been appropriating design for decades towards their specific needs. As Hardy and his colleagues posit, there's a need to understand the rural as a rich source of design inspiration for HTI research, design and innovation. Taking this stance, we argue the importance of understanding rural needs and values as a source of inspiration before the deployment of technology for community radio in rural areas. Community radio is a community-owned and run form of radio. It is intended to promote freedom of expression and provide a platform for community members to participate in community activities and decisions. This may be important in rural areas where there have been a decline in local TV and radio, which has been taken over by national media. Understanding innovation in rural technology design has become particularly important with the growth of new and novel technologies for community radio, tailored for rural areas. One example is Ruscio, and with Ruscio we have adopted this as part of the Grassroots Radio Project. It was initially designed for rural communities in Uganda to participate in local issues by broadcasting only using a mobile phone, and in this sense thus eliminating the need for expensive radio equipment. While such developments are fruitful, there is still little known about the impact of such new technologies and specifically in rural communities. As we argued earlier, it's particularly important to centre towards rural needs and values, and use this as a source of inspiration when considering how these can be deployed. Thus, the goal of the study was to ask 2 questions. 1. What are the needs and values of people in rural communities? And 2. What considerations could be posed, particularly when deploying new technology for community radio in rural communities? So with grassroots radio, with the goal of lowering the barriers of setting up and running a community radio station in rural communities, we involved 6 rural communities on the peripheries of Europe. The overall project employs participatory action research, where each local community, through gatekeepers, is involved in setting up community radio stations. In this paper, we focus on the 3 communities as part of the project. Our data includes field observations that were collected between August 2018 and July 2019, as well as 25 interviews across all 3 communities. These interviews are conducted in the main language, summarised in English once they were transcribed. The 3 communities that we focused on are West Island off the coast of Ireland and 2 small rural communities in Romania. All 3 communities have small populations, with West Island holding less than 200 people. West Island is only accessible via ferry. Similarly, East Island can only be accessed by boat, which often freezes in winter time. South Village is 18 kilometres away from the nearest urban city, which is often inaccessible via public transport. In our paper, we identify 5 themes that emerge from our data. These themes include revitalising community, which raises the need of all 3 communities to sustain traditions and social activity in rural areas. A second theme is sharing information for natural emergencies and health, which highlights the challenge for each rural community in accessing emergency services when needed, and also sustaining those services. In another theme, we highlight the practical concerns around community radio. Here we highlight the concerns of community members in being accountable if things go wrong with the radio, or how their voice is represented. More information can be found in the paper for those 3 themes. Here I'll focus on the following two: supporting community connections and reclaiming local decision-making and supporting advocacy. The first theme was supporting community connections. Interviews across all three communities have highlighted the need for maintaining current populations while also maintaining and strengthening connections with those currently living in the area. Maintaining population is a big challenge, as highlighted by this interview in West Island. Outmigration is frequent, so sustaining the population is a big one. So in this case, having more kids or being born on the island particularly and living on the island is a bit of a buzz, because that way you can sustain the school or even sustain other types of services that are available. Without migration comes decline in services which are important for rural communities to sustain. There was also a strong need across all three communities to connect with diaspora near and afar. As a result of outmigration, many people living across West Island, East Village and South Village reported having relatives such as children, brothers or sisters, or even friends living or working elsewhere. Having a radio or a means for those living afar to listen or participate in radio was seen as useful. As highlighted by an interviewer from West Island, who currently lives away, this person also seems to suggest that diaspora may benefit more from community radio, as it maintains the need to keep up to date with local topics, concerns and news, even if you're living away, but maintain some sort of connection with those in rural communities. The next theme we focus on is reclaiming local decision-making and supporting advocacy. As geographically isolated peripheries in Europe, all three communities voiced quite strongly the need to participate in local decisions. There is a shared consensus that decisions affecting the local are often made in urban centres, such as the closest capital or city. In those decisions, locals are rarely involved in advocating for decisions that affect them. And here, this has been expressed by a resident in East Village, particularly on the topic of exploitation and fishing. So, in summary, before the 90s, the river basin was populated by fish, but afterwards, the 90s, it wasn't populated with fish at all because people were taking the fish and not pushing them back. And in this case, it meant that there was no fish for anyone else to catch, and no action was taken. The limited means for portraying voice may have had an impact on the community's ability to take action. So what do these findings mean for HTI Research, or those designing community radio or technology more generally in rural areas? Well, in our paper we pose considerations for implementing technology for community radio in rural areas. Categories of consideration we detail in the paper include, firstly, reimagining radio to meet community needs, which focuses on supporting community members in discovering new uses for radio, which could serve in their communities. We also highlighted the need to build trust, and also around new radio technologies and tools, especially those who have concerns towards community representation and maintaining professional status on the radio. Considerations towards advocacy and a platform for sharing local voice is also consideration, especially to open connections with officials to ensure that the voices of those living in rural communities are heard in decisions that affect them. In this presentation, we will focus on community radio for geographically distributed communities as a consideration. A core need that emerged from our work was that of connecting with others associated with rural areas who are located elsewhere, including those in other countries, as you can see from this map. Without migration being common across all three communities, there was a desire for those living afar to remain connected or keep up to date with local issues, news and concerns. In some cases, it appeared to be more important to keep those living afar connected than those geographically based. But when it comes to community radio implementations, two forms of connection dominate the community radio realm. While there are others, we'll focus on these two. The first being FM. With FM, it is important to consider that transmission is bound to particular geographical space. So if we look at the diaspora here, for instance, FM may not be an appropriate solution for connecting those groups living afar, particularly the diaspora or people maintaining connections with the rural. Another form of connection of radio is internet streaming, and streaming provides the means for diaspora living afar to connect and participate in local community radio. However, with the openness of internet, an important question raised by Rosemary Day in her research and in her book, what range is too large to be considered community? Reimagining radio for this diaspora and those living afar appears to be an important design consideration that has been overlooked. In this presentation, we have discussed the needs and values of people living in rural regions, which ought to be considered when implementing new radio technologies for community radio purposes in rural regions. For more information on this project, please consult our paper in the ACM link. You can also access this link by scanning the QR code provided. Follow us on Twitter with this handle here. Thank you for listening.